It's stating the obvious to say that NFL teams that draft better perform better on the field. But how effective does the average Super Bowl champion need to be with their selections? Let's try to answer that question. The first thing we need to do is decide on a metric for long-term drafting effectiveness rather than any one draft. It could be argued that a single spectacular draft class was enough to overcome previous years of subpar drafting and propel a team to a Super Bowl victory, but we're going to treat those cases as anomalies. The most basic method would be to say that if a draft pick makes the roster, it was a successful pick. So let's start with that. We need to decide if we're just going to use game day rosters, and if so, are we going to just use the week 1 roster, or maybe an average number across all weeks? The simplest method is to count any player who is on the active roster anytime during the season. But is it really that easy? Let's find out by looking at the numbers from the 2025 season. Here are the numbers for each team, but we need to look at a graph of these totals versus the number of wins for each team. We could use point differentials or some other power ranking, but wins are ultimately what gets a team to the Super Bowl. There's a positive correlation, but we haven't taken into account the impact of the draft picks. ProFootballReference.com has a metric called approximate value, which is a numerical value that allows for comparisons across eras and positions and provides a comprehensive summary of a player's impact. If we add up the approximate values for all the draft picks on all the rosters of each team and look at a graph of those numbers, the correlation is quite a bit stronger. So the metric we'll use is approximate value of drafted players, or AVD. Now we need to get an average AVD value for Super Bowl champions. So how far back should we go? There have been 32 teams in the NFL since the 2002 season, so that seems like a good place to start. The 53-man roster has also been the same since then, with the only major difference being the number of games increasing from 16 to 17. But that shouldn't affect our calculations, since we're really just interested in a team's AVD relative to other teams. Here are the values for each Super Bowl champion since 2002. So to answer our original question, a current Super Bowl champion should have a total approximate value of about 135 for players who were on their roster during the season and were selected by that team in the NFL Draft. Last year's Super Bowl participants, the Seattle Seahawks and New England Patriots, both had an AVD of about 120. And if we look closer at the graph of 2025 values, we can see that there is a peak in wins around that number, which is an interesting result and may suggest that teams with AVD values that are too large are not utilizing free agency enough or as effectively. When we get a little closer to the start of the 2026 season, we'll do a more complete analysis of roster construction for Super Bowl champions. So what about 2026? Let's do some extrapolation. These are the current number of draft picks on the roster for each team about 3 weeks before the draft. Based on last year's numbers, each team will add an average of about 3 draft picks to the roster between the draft and the end of the season. This accounts for signing newly drafted players, as well as roster cuts or players moved to the practice squad. So we'll add 3 for each team. We'll also apply the average AVD value for each team from 2025. The average AVD for Super Bowl champions was about 135, so we'll assume that there's a 50% chance that a team with an AVD greater than that will win the Super Bowl, and 50% for a team with less than 135. After some trial and error of distribution curves based on AVD that fit our 50-50 split, we can assign a percentage to each team. So based on the AVD numbers we've projected, the top 5 teams with the best chance to win the Super Bowl are the Philadelphia Eagles, Houston Texans, Buffalo Bills, Denver Broncos, and the Detroit Lions. Detroit was the only one of the 5 that failed to make the playoffs last year, but all of the others won a game in the playoffs. Last year's champions, the Seattle Seahawks, came in at number 18, and the runner-up New England Patriots came in at 13. The Los Angeles Rams, who are the current favorite of most sportsbooks, come in at 11th on the list. The sportsbooks seem to like the teams in about the 120 to 130 AVD range the best when it comes to Super Bowl odds, so maybe there is something to our theory that this could be a sweet spot between playing and re-signing draft picks versus free agents. All comments, suggestions, and feedback are appreciated, and thanks for watching.